Every time you think football is just a game, it hits you with stories that feel like it was ripped straight out of a crime documentary, like a World Cup own goal that ended with bullets flying in a car park, or this Brazilian footballer who fed his ex to dogs. And what of the Calciopoli scandal where Luciano Moggi's web of bribes and backroom threats was darker than most fans ever realized? Well, today, we are diving deep into all the dark stories you won't hear anywhere else. And the first one will make you question if football is even worth dying for. The own goal that shook Colombia. If you've ever wondered how dangerous football can get when mixed with the wrong people, Colombia in the early 90s is your answer. Andrés Escobar was the kind of player you'd want on your team. He was calm, reliable, and classy both on and off the pitch. But then came the 1994 World Cup and that own goal against the USA. Most countries would be upset, sure, but in Colombia, where drug cartels basically ran the country and had millions riding on matches, this wasn't just bad luck, it was a financial disaster for some very scary people. So, days after returning home, Escobar went out with friends in Medellin, probably thinking the anger had cooled off. Well, it hadn't, because just outside a nightclub, he was shot 6 times. 6. Over a football match. The guy who pulled the trigger allegedly had cartel ties, and it was all linked to betting losses. Imagine your team's unlucky moment leading to someone's death. The tragedy is that Escobar had just written a column about moving forward and keeping perspective. Instead, his death became a warning that in some places, football isn't just a game. It's a high-stakes gamble with real bullets. And speaking of bullets in football, that brings us to Bruno Fernandes de Souza's orchestrated murder. If football had a hall of shame, Bruno's name would be carved at the top. At the time, he was Flamengo's captain, a fan favorite, and on the verge of a national team spot. Then, everything imploded. His ex-girlfriend, Eliza Samudio, had accused him of fathering her child and demanded support. But what followed sounds like something straight from a true crime series. But it's real. Bruno and a group of accomplices kidnapped her, tortured her, and murdered her. The details are stomach-turning, and according to testimony, her body was fed to dogs to hide the evidence. The fact that this even happened around someone so prominent in Brazilian football is insane enough, but what really gets me is what happened after. He got a 22-year sentence, served part of it, and then, somehow, got signed by another club when he got out on a temporary release. Fans protested, but others welcomed him like a returning hero. It's like people forgot what he did because he could stop a penalty. It makes you wonder how much talent can blind people to a person's actual character. And that idea of football blinding people to the ugly truths is something you'll see again in the next story. Emiliano Sala's death and the black market transfer. Emiliano Sala's move from Nantes to Cardiff City was supposed to be a dream transfer, but it turned into one of football's scariest stories. Sala was flying from France to Wales in a small private plane arranged by intermediaries, not the clubs. The first issue was that the pilot was unlicensed for commercial flights. Oh, and the plane was also not certified for night flying. It crashed into the English Channel and killed both of them. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident, but then the details started leaking. The transfer negotiations were a mess, intermediaries were fighting over fees, and no one was willing to take responsibility for arranging proper travel. Cardiff and Nantes ended up in a long legal war over the transfer fee while Sala's family was left grieving and searching for answers. And the craziest part was that this wasn't some one-off. Plenty of players travel in risky conditions because clubs and agents want things done cheap and fast. Sala's death was supposed to spark reform, but in football, money usually wins the conversation. And speaking of money winning the conversation, our next stop takes us to Italy. Calciopoly's hidden threats. Everyone knows Calciopoli as the scandal where Juventus and other Serie A clubs got caught influencing referee appointments. What doesn't get talked about as much is the other layer, the intimidation. Some referees didn't just get calls from club executives, they were visited by people you wouldn't want showing up at your door. Whispers about organized crime involvement in certain matches have been around for decades, and during Calciopoli, some investigators hinted at it, but it never made the headlines. Why? Because when Mafia names start floating around football, people clam up. Witnesses refused to testify, files went missing, and the story stayed safe for public consumption. And even after punishments were handed out, fans were split. Some called it justice, while others claimed it was all overblown. The reality is, if you were playing in Serie A in that era, you were in a league where the lines between sport and influence were dangerously blurred. And when intimidation works in men's football, it makes you think about places where the danger isn't just to the game, but to the players' lives. Which brings us to our next story: the disappeared Afghan women's national team in 2021. When the Taliban retook Afghanistan in 2021, the Afghan women's national team basically vanished from public life overnight. These were women who had been symbols of progress, who had publicly stood against an oppressive regime. Now, their visibility puts targets on their backs. Reports started coming in that some players had gone into hiding, others fled the country, and some, according to rumors, were killed. FIFA released polite statements, but actual rescue operations were largely down to individual activists, NGOs, and former players scrambling to get people out. It wasn't a football scandal in the traditional sense, but it was one of the darkest chapters in the sport because it showed how quickly a team can go from representing their country to being hunted by it. And while most of the world moved on after a few headlines, the reality is some of those players are still unaccounted for. Robert Enke's suicide in football's mental health cover-up. Robert Enke was one of those goalkeepers who looked unshakable on the pitch. You know, the guy you'd trust to stop a penalty in the 90th minute. But away from the cameras, he was fighting a battle no one could see. He struggled with depression for years, and the football culture at the time made it nearly impossible to be open about it. Imagine being a top athlete in Germany, knowing that if you admit you're struggling mentally, you might lose your career, your contracts, and your reputation. On November 10, 2009, Enke stepped in front of a train. He left a note, apologizing. But the real tragedy is how preventable it might have been if football had taken mental health seriously. Back then, you didn't hear managers saying, "We're protecting his mental well-being." You heard, "He needs to toughen up." And even now, over a decade later, football still has moments where it feels like nothing's changed. It's one thing to talk about protecting players from injury, but protecting them from the mental strain of the game? That's still treated like some optional extra. And speaking of football's failure to protect its own, the next story involves a player who wasn't even in danger on the pitch until politics got involved and the game couldn't save him. Hakeem Al-Araibi's detention. Hakeem Al-Araibi was a Bahraini footballer who'd spoken out against his country's government, accusing them of human rights abuses, and that made him a political enemy back home. He fled to Australia, got asylum, and started playing semi-pro football. Then, in 2018, he went on his honeymoon to Thailand, probably thinking it would just be beaches and relaxation. Instead, Thai police arrested him on an Interpol red notice, issued at Bahrain's request. If he'd been sent back, there was a real chance he'd be tortured or killed. The crazy part was that FIFA and the AFC barely lifted a finger at first. It took a massive public campaign to pressure them into acting. Eventually, he was freed and returned to Australia, but the message was loud and clear. Football likes to say it protects its players, but when politics get messy, the game suddenly loses its voice. And if you think politics is dangerous, wait until you hear about when football and organized crime sat at the same table. Emiliano López's murder over a football bet. In Argentina's lower leagues, Emiliano López wasn't a superstar, but he was good enough to make an impact. That's what got him tangled up in a betting dispute. Reports say he was involved in a match that was fixed, the kind of thing run by local Mafia-controlled gambling rings. Somewhere along the line, someone felt cheated. Maybe the bet didn't pay off, or maybe the scoreline went wrong, and López became the scapegoat. He was shot dead in Buenos Aires, just like that. A player whose biggest dream might have been moving up divisions ended up in the ground over a match most people didn't even watch. Jean-Pierre Adams' 39-year coma. Jean-Pierre Adams was a French international defender who went in for routine knee surgery in 1982. Nothing major, just the kind of thing players get all the time. But the anesthetist gave him 8 times the recommended dose, and he slipped into a coma. He stayed in that coma for 39 years, but his wife cared for him at home the entire time, refusing to put him in a facility, even though the hospital staff responsible for his condition walked away without any real punishment. Imagine a player disappearing from the sport for nearly 4 decades, not because of injury or age, but because of pure medical negligence. And yet, the story was barely mentioned outside France. It wasn't dramatic enough for TV highlights, but it's arguably one of the darkest, most heartbreaking stories football has ever seen. And if that sounds like it couldn't get more sinister, here's what happens when you dig too deep into football's ugliest secrets. Andrés Topo Velázquez's murder, Mexico, 2019. Topo Velázquez was a football journalist who did more than just cover games. He went after the truth. And in Mexico, that meant exposing how drug cartels had infiltrated parts of Liga MX. He reported on shady ownership deals, suspicious player transfers, and match-fixing whispers nobody else wanted to touch. Then, one night in 2019, he was found dead in his car after being shot multiple times. Authorities called it a robbery gone wrong, but people who knew him say he'd been receiving threats for months. Football loves to sell itself as the beautiful game, but stories like this remind you that there's a whole side of it that's rotten, where truth gets you silenced and the ball isn't the only thing that gets kicked around. And that's the thing about football. You can spend your whole life watching the beautiful game, but every now and then you stumble on something that makes you wonder if the beautiful part was just good marketing. If you've got your own football dark story, drop it in the comments. I want to see the wildest stories you've got. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one goes way deeper than this.